In violent crimes, in 2024, there were a total of 197,000 suspects, of whom around 43% were non-Germans. But there are a lot of non-Germans. This also includes violent Dutch or Swiss people living in Germany, or even tourists who become violent after 3 hours in an Oktoberfest tent.
Just like that, clarity became naivete. Certainty becomes arrogance, and the person who refuses to commit to anything suddenly looks oh so wise. Like a monk of ambiguity hovering above the dirty world where decisions actually matter. The truth is that the invoked complexity doesn't really explain anything, it just roleplays as competence. It's the intellectual equivalent of violently convulsing in front of a predator, so it thinks that you're sick and not worth eating. This performance has become the most insufferable circle jerk of modernity. Being forced as a German to watch a state-funded broadcaster contort crime statistics in real time isn't education. It is instead the postmodern version of Chinese water torture. The whole ritual is designed to humiliate basic pattern recognition. It is a ceremony of moral domination. You will unsee what you see, you will doubt what you know, and you will call it nuance.
Are established risk factors for criminality, independent of a person's specific background or origin. Okay, so how do we get rid of men now?
I present to you the state-funded midwit, an averagely intelligent but over-credentialed person who has been handed cognitive weaponry beyond their capacity. Trained to critique, qualify and bicker, but not to synthesize, to judge or build any knowledge. Midwits don't lack information, they lack integration. They have enough vocabulary to confuse a room and not enough spine to conclude a sentence. They are allergic to closure, because closure is accountability. They can deconstruct anything, but they can't build anything. That's thankfully not a personality quirk, it's an institutional product. Somewhere along the way, academia inverted one of the most simplest and important tools of thinking. Occam's razor. Do not multiply explanation beyond necessity. If a simple explanation sufficiently accounts for the facts, prefer it. Some modern institutions teach the opposite. An idea gains value through density, through footnotes, through layers of qualification, through endless contextualization, and of course, through hiding an intellectual turd under a wedding cake of citations.
The assumption that foreigners or asylum seekers have a higher propensity for crime than demographically comparable locals is not tenable.
All of which are of course inconclusive and circular if you actually dare to look at them. Thank God nobody except for me seems to do that. The more tangled the explanation, the more intelligent it feels, naturally. The harder it is to state plainly, the more serious it looks. Thus we live inside of a social hierarchy, where the ability to avoid conclusions is mistaken for insight and knowledge. Clarity becomes suspicious, and moral certainty is almost vulgar. If you point out the obvious shortcomings without a dissertation attached, you are treated like you committed a hate crime against the concept of nuance, as if you needed to be a chicken to know what a rotten egg is. Believe it or not, that's not sophistication. It's the aesthetic of intelligence without any responsibility. It is the cosplay of thought. This breed thrives in one habitat: modern academia, especially the social sciences. Not because these fields can't produce useful knowledge, but because they incentivize a specific posture: rhetorical survival. The social science midwit is the perfected organism for this environment. He's trained to endlessly problematize and not resolve anything. He's trained to interrogate and not integrate. Always trained to detect power and not truth, and God forbid if those two align. And of course he's trained to win any language game and not produce any outcome after. They can endlessly interrogate the living shit out of anything until the cost of engaging with them becomes infinite. And thus, their total victory is achieved. You lose by participating. This happens because a conclusion is very expensive. It exposes you, it binds you to consequences, and it gives others something to attack. It puts your ego on the table, like a poker hand. In order to evade that, the midwit has to hover. He orbits ideas without landing and dissolves meaning without rebuilding it, and thus mistakes perpetual questioning for intelligence. It's the type of person that would watch your house burn down while they explain to you that historically, the concept of fire safety is socially constructed. What a funny line, isn't it? Until you realize that this exact posture now runs policy. Nowhere is this more visible or more morally obscene than in the migration crime debate, because here the performance of depth doesn't just waste your time. It bleaches guilt. The trick is always the same. You're allowed to look at the numbers, briefly. You're even allowed to admit overrepresentation, momentarily. But the very second that your brain tries to connect A to B, wait, if migrants commit more crime, then more migrants would mean more crime, right? A seminar forms around your throat to stop any wrong thing from escaping your mouth. It always starts with a predictable sequence. First is dilution.
There are a lot of non-Germans. This also includes violent Dutch or Swiss people living in Germany.
Obviously, this is not specificity, it's fog. Non-Germans are many. Swiss, Dutch, tourists, Oktoberfest drunks. The public debate isn't about violent Dutch cyclists or Swiss accountants losing their minds at the beer tent. It's about a specific migration category, a very specific cohort, specific patterns that don't just vanish because someone discovered tourism. This is a very lazy psychological trick to broaden the category until the audience forgets what question they were asking. This is then of course followed by a sanctified technicality.
The police crime statistics refer to suspects, not convicted offenders.
Yeah, true, and useless for the sake of the argument. A suspect isn't imaginary, it means the state thinks it was this person. After a process of investigation, and for violent crimes, the idea that the police is collectively hallucinating mass suspects is not rigorous skepticism, it's a coping mechanism. None of this erases the pattern. Just stop to think for a moment. If there's a suspect, then there's a victim. The victim is conveniently thrown under the bus for the sake of a narrative that we will discuss later. The midwit doesn't want any accuracy. They want uncertainty, because uncertainty can be weaponized into inaction. This inaction is enabled through their last ace, the metaphysical downgrade. See, crime becomes an emergent property within their premise. Not an action, nor a choice or a moral event. It becomes a phenomena. A risk outcome like mold on your wall, or traffic, or the weather. And thus, crimes of sexual nature and violent crime stop being treated as acts committed by people and become structural inevitabilities that float out of conditions. You can do this if you want to find new hypotheses or construct scientific instruments around this. But in the context of a public broadcast, trying to explain to you how your assertion that migration might lead to increased criminality, this clearly becomes manipulative. As crime, within our framework here, is not just a passive occurrence. A person doesn't just trip and fall into crime. They decide, they act, and they often conceal it afterward. When you dissolve agency into an abstraction like that, to deflect guilt, you commit a profound moral violation. As you replace responsibility with causality, judgment with an explanation, and thus you sandblast the horror of the act itself. This is where any nuance stops being intellectual and becomes a moral evasion. This isn't just wrong, it's grotesque, because once you frame crimes like forced cuddling as systemic, you must build systemic solutions. But systemic solutions don't punish. Collective punishment is illegal. Systemic solutions instead fund. If poverty causes crime, well then funding becomes a prevention. If marginalization causes crime, then inclusion programs become safeguards. And if exclusion likewise causes crime, then the solution becomes endless accommodation, as if you're trying to negotiate with reality. Please don't violate our woman, here is a grant. And yes, in the most polite bureaucratic way possible, you create a lever that rewards the worst outcomes with resources while everyone else becomes an afterthought. You don't really have to claim that anyone is incentivized to commit a crime, like a cartoon villain. That's not how incentives work. Incentives don't require intent, only predictable outcomes. The predictable outcome, however, that this approach, that systemic factors are the reason for criminality in our societies create, is the following. The more a group generates the need through criminality, the more the system has to feed it. The more risk, the more support gets justified, and the more headlines they produce, the more programs they deserve. And all the groups that don't generate these problems, well, they get to pay for it. Through this approach, the taxpayer is forced into a hostage negotiation with baseline civilization. Please don't commit any crimes that you were already morally obligated not to commit. Here's a package. That's not compassion, it's insanity. But the midwit will smile while doing it, because it lets them play savior without naming the problem. This crumbles away instantly. Just think about what happens to victims in this worldview. Once a crime becomes a systemic risk, then the victim becomes a risk manager. Don't go through the park, don't dress like that, don't be out late, be careful. But believe it or not, walking alone through a park is not the problem. Neither is the park, nor her risk factors. The problem is that she will be exposed to life-changing events, and once you systematize that, society inherits the obligation to manage these risk factors. Instead of confronting the offenders, we think that maybe we didn't provide enough aid, maybe we didn't run enough programs, maybe we didn't accommodate enough, and maybe we should soften enforcement a bit more. And thus, the moral foundation slips. Instead of training citizens through norms, deterrence, enforcement, and shame not to behave like predators, we train everyone else to behave like prey. Even though some people call it that, it's not progress. It is instead cultural surrender through paperwork. I'm sure many will point out that both can be true at once. You can still condemn the perpetrator while using systemic incentives to stop crime from happening. That's not wrong on the surface, but through engaging with the conversation in this very way on a public broadcaster nonetheless, you train the individual political actor inside of your democratic body to abdicate their responsibility into a bigger abstract system. You effectively create a game of hot potato that circles endlessly, because the way that you talk about these problems is not intended for a public conversation, but instead a scientific exploration, one that you're afraid of honestly undergoing because of your bureaucratic dogma. The final irony of all of this is that it harms migrants. Of course, the migrant is everyone and anyone who came here somehow, but whatever. This rhetoric harms migrants because crime clusters socially. It's local, it's proximate, it's neighborhood and network, which means a lot of victims of migrant crime are other migrants. Thus, when postmodern clerics use nuance to block clarity, they're not protecting migrants, they are protecting a narrative. They are protecting the comfort of the educated class. And thus they're making real solutions harder, because solutions require naming patterns clearly enough to target them. The urbanization escape hatch is perfect as an example for this.
Rather, they are more likely to live here under conditions that increase the risk of criminal behavior.
Maybe, partly, but as an explanation, it's as useful as drinking your own piss for hydration. Cities don't commit crime, and streetlights don't commit crime. Neither does population density one day wake up and decide to violate someone. The urbanization study can't even answer its own causal direction. Are the rates high because migrants moved to higher crime areas, or are the rates high because the crime moved with them? Or is it both? Their own study doesn't know, and that part gets conveniently left out. If you cannot disentangle causality, you don't get to use the uncertainty as absolution. This very leap from caveat to exoneration is their entire religion. The intellectual mujahideen has to perform at least 4 relativizations.
Since we know that people perceived as foreign are both checked more often and reported more frequently, it stands to reason that they are also more often wrongly suspected. The police crime statistics refer to suspects, not convicted offenders. It applies to German suspects in violent crimes as well. Among them, 81% are male, even though men make up only about half of the population. Migrants are overrepresented in violent crimes. However, the idea that they are more prone to crime or violence solely because of their origin is not scientifically proven. Rather, they are more likely to live here under conditions that increase the risk of criminal behavior.
It's just unbelievable. But let me make one of my own then. If it's war and trauma, then why don't the Vietnamese, your own migration group Mai, who literally fled the Vietnam War, display these patterns? They were visibly foreign from day one. They got hit with real bigotry, and they were likely traumatized. Many had no money, didn't speak the language, couldn't read the script, lived on the margins, and thus checked every box a social scientist loves to pull off the shelf as a universal explanation for crime. Marginalization, exclusion, structural disadvantage, trauma, and yet they basically don't show up as a problem group in crime statistics. If it's poverty, then why did the Vietnamese community, once they arrived, produce higher educational outcomes and higher upward mobility than the average German, despite starting off worse? So no, the magic grab bag of side factors doesn't explain what it claims to explain. Because there are groups that had the trauma, had the poverty, and had the discrimination back when people were actually more openly bigoted, and they still didn't produce the same behavioral footprint. Your systemic narrative disproves itself with your own background, for fuck's sake. And that is what the midwit can't say out loud, because it would break the spell. That the real crisis isn't that society is also complex. The real crisis is that we declared judgment immoral. We took the one faculty a civilization cannot live without, moral clarity, and replaced it with a bureaucratic fog machine. We replaced the citizen's duty to discern right from wrong with an institutional reflex to explain everything until nothing is anyone's fault, but somehow everyone's responsibility. Except the perpetrators, of course, they are just victims of the circumstances. When nothing is anyone's fault anymore, then nothing can be corrected. That is what nuance has become, a way of keeping the world at permanent malfunction while sounding like you're helping. None of this is compassion. It is instead abdication, the refusal to bear the cost of saying, this is wrong and someone chose to do it because of his inherent intrinsic motivators. Like cultural norms. Because that's the truth that the ritual exists to avoid. A criminal isn't a weather event, he's a moral agent, and treating him as a moral agent and thus holding him to consequence is not dehumanizing, but the opposite. To prosecute a man is to dignify him, because it treats him as someone capable of choosing. That's what the state is for, to judge and process, not to be a therapist for predators, not to be a PR department for narratives, and not to moralize itself into a church through the most pathetic circle jerk of the century. The state has about as much virtue as a hammer. It exists to enforce boundaries that allow ordinary people to live without fear. And when those boundaries dissolve, it's not the educated that pay first, it's the woman in the park, it's the girl at the station, it's the migrant family living next door to the worst of their own countrymen. It's the honest, the small, and the exposed. Civilization is the right to walk through your own nation without being hunted. And the first duty of the citizen is to defend that right by refusing the lie that judgment is cruelty. You think that's cultural? Well, you see, actually it's more complicated.